Not that long ago, I put out the call for questions relating to the Pokemon TCG on my YouTube channel. A number of you answered the call, and we're going to answer those questions today. I'm Jet from inthirdperson.com. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's get into the latest edition of our Pokemon TCG Community Q&A. Full disclosure, the intro and outro of this video are recorded at a different time from the question and answer part. I originally recorded this to go up on Friday, but stuff came up, so we are doing this at a different time. I have to record a different intro outro, but the questions are the same. Let's get into it. First one comes from Andre Vadana 6905, who asks, where do you get the decks you cover in your videos? That's a great question. So on this channel, we mostly cover meta decks, and then we'll dip our toe into the row tier territory from time to time. And because of that, there's a lot of reference material I can look at in terms of deck lists. And I will, for the most part, look at other deck lists and then make adjustments as I see fit. Sometimes I will cook from scratch. I think there was a Samurott video that I really wanted to cover Samurott at a time when no one was covering Samurott, so I just made the deck. And there was a Pikachu VMAX video that's a little older now, but that was a card no one was playing, and I wanted to give it a shot, so I made my own deck and then put it out there into the world. Thank you to everybody that watched that video back in the day. But for the most part, I'm looking at tournament results and seeing what's doing well and covering those decks. My go-to source of information is play.limitlesstcg.com. We've got the site pulled up here, and I know it's cutting off at the top here, but I like to go to the decks section, and you can see all of the decks based on meta share in online tournaments. So we can see Gardevoir is the most popular deck in the Twilight Masquerade format. So you just pick an archetype. Here's Gardevoir, and then just look at the list. And I personally like to sort by date, because over time the meta will change in a format, and so I like to look at whatever is the latest one and just start seeing what's going on from here. So here's a list from Orange Clarinet, and let's give it a look together. And based on this, like, maybe I'll play it straight up. Sometimes I will go out of my way to play a deck that I'm not comfortable with to showcase how it works and get myself more familiar with how things work, but sometimes I will make adjustments as well. I'll try multiple lists, and if I can't find an exact 60 that I like, I will make adjustments to the closest one and go from there. Just eyeballing this list, it freaks me out that there's no Drifloon in here. I would probably take out one Fluttermane and put in a Drifloon. They do have Crisis Punch in here, Evolution, Devolution, some cards that I'm not necessarily comfortable with Gardevoir in, but I'm also a little behind on Gardevoir. I will get myself refreshed on Gardevoir soon, and maybe we'll play something like this. But generally speaking, the idea is I look for a deck list on a resource and tweak it to my liking. Also on Limitless, I like to go to the tournaments section, and then I will go to the completed tab down here, and you can filter based on Pokemon TCG. And here's all the tournaments and how many players were in the tournament. And I like to look at the tournaments that have over 100 players. Like, if it's a tournament of 7 people and some random deck wins, that may not necessarily indicate that this deck was particularly great. So yeah, I haven't looked at what the results of this tournament were, but I'll click on this, see what stands out of, we've got in 9th place, we've got a Sinistra Ogerpon deck. 19 energy, hold on. By the time you see this video, I may have covered this deck. This actually looks kind of cool. I love Teal Mask Ogerpon right now. And so yeah, that also gives me an angle for, hey, this deck that you may have missed from this tournament did really well. Here we go. Here is one of the other places I will go look for tournament results. For Japanese decks, so their format's a little different. They are oftentimes a set or two ahead, and for that I will go to Twitter on Pokekabook, and this is an awesome resource for getting an understanding of what's competitive. Here's one of their most recent tier lists, and this is in their Stellar Miracle format, so they're a bit ahead of us right now. But in particular, if I'm looking to get an idea of what decks are going to be hot later, or get an idea of the different ways people are building decks in Japan, I will use Pokekabook as a reference. Those are my main sources. So between Limitless and Pokekabook, or cooking a deck myself, that's kind of where I get my lists from. I generally try and avoid YouTube, and not necessarily because I don't like other content creators out there. I mean, shout outs to everybody in the Pokemon TCG YouTube community, but I try to minimize the amount of overlap between myself and other creators in the space. That said, there's going to be times where we overlap out of happenstance. Like, for example, the World Championships is coming up, and a lot of us are going to be cover whatever deck wins the World Championships, and it's just going to be that way because that's what everybody's talking about at that point in time. I know recently I put out a video on Dragon Ball Charizard, and there were comments in the YouTube of like, yeah, is this LDF's list? And I know it's almost LDF's list. It's actually off by one card. I found a deck in tournament that was slightly different, and I intentionally picked one that was slightly different. Not to say LDF's list is bad. I think it's great. But if you want to watch a video with LDF's list, you can go watch LDF, and he's one of the most, Lil Dark Fury, for anyone that doesn't know, is one of the most popular Pokemon TCG channels. And then also the Shuffle Squad covered the exact same list. So in times where there is overlap like that in the YouTube space, I try and do something a little different, maybe tweak a couple cards here and there, or just try and put out that video at another time. But, you know, shout outs to LDF, shout outs to the Shuffle Squad, shout outs to everybody else in the Pokemon TCG YouTube community. So lots of different places to get ideas for decks. And again, like, there are tons of resources out there, but I always encourage people to use them as a reference point. You might find a deck that literally won the World Championships, and you'll try it out and be like, you know what? I actually think it would prefer if it tweaked this, and this. And, well, on one hand, yes, this deck won the World Championships for a reason, but on the other hand, maybe you're playing in a different meta against different people who are playing different decks, and your play style might be different too. So adjusting some cards here and there probably won't hurt, depending on how dramatic of the change that you're making. And I always encourage players to, whether it's my channel or Limitless, Pokekabook, look at a bunch of different lists from a certain archetype that you're looking to play as a reference point, and then make adjustments as you see fit. This next one comes from Young Mucker 7546, who asks, I recently started playing and came across your channel, and I've been loving the content. Oh, thank you. But what would you say is the best deck to play for beginners? That's a fantastic question. First off, welcome to the Pokemon TCG community, and welcome to everybody who is just discovering the Pokemon trading card game. And so when it comes to beginner-friendly decks, I think that some of the best beginner decks are, and let's jump over to my screen over here. I think the best beginner deck you could be playing right now is Raging Bolt with Ogerpon. It's a deck that is very consistent. It's only basic Pokemon. You don't have to worry about evolving. It also hits like a truck. It is not that hard to get enough energy on your first few turns that you can one-hit KO pretty much anything in the game. Now, Raging Bolt does have some weaknesses. It struggles against single prize decks, even with the Sandy Shocks in here to kind of offset the prize map. But it's still a deck that is on the lower end of the difficulty scale to play, and it's very strong against the meta. Charizard EX isn't necessarily the easiest deck to play, but it's definitely one I would recommend starting with first. And that's because Charizard is incredibly strong. You also get the cards, a lot of the cards for a Charizard deck in Pokemon TCG Live for free. And with experience, that it's like one of, if not the best deck in the game. And Charizard is also an interesting deck in that you can tech it to do a lot of different things. And this one is a little more teched out. We've got the Enhanced Hammer, we've got the Mist Energy. It's certainly not the hardest deck to learn, but I do find that there are some intricacies with sequencing, especially with Lumineon, Arven combos with Forest Seal Stone, that can really help you get your Charizard set up and just think about sequencing in a way of how do I set up my deck so that I am in the best position to play the rest of the game. Another deck that I think is very beginner friendly is Dialga V-Star. This one is one where a lot of the energy acceleration is handled by Matang. So it's a little bit of a dice roll with Matang, because sometimes you're going to hit a bunch of energy and sometimes you won't. But you don't have to worry too much about sequencing, because it's really about getting your turn 1 established and hopefully getting a bunch of your Matangs and Dialga V-Stars on turn 2, and then allowing the Metal Maker ability to carry you through to the finish line. For the most part, I understand there's more to it than that, but relative to other decks, there is less to think about when playing Dialga V-Star. One last one that I think is more on the beginner-friendly side is Ancient Box. And this is one, again, doesn't have any evolution Pokemon, so you don't have to worry about that. It's a deck that can start attacking from turn 1. You're primarily swinging with Roaring Moon over and over again. Some Ancient Box decks have the Roaring Moon EX, some do not, and that's fine. But it's a very straightforward game plan. You're looking to play Sada's Vitality every single time for the most part, and this is a deck that you just kind of set up very quickly and just swing over and over and over again. So it's a pretty straightforward deck relative to other decks out there, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. I find in particular, like, people who buy the League Battle deck are like, oh, I've got this deck, and everyone says Gardevoir is the best deck in the game, and then they play it and are like, oh, I keep losing. And it's not because Gardevoir is bad, it's because Gardevoir is actually really hard to play. There are things to consider when picking a deck, such as like the skill ceiling and how difficult the deck is to play, and I think it's worth exploring a lot of different decks where possible, so you can find the deck that fits your playstyle and your experience in the game. Like, even as someone who has been playing the game for years, I personally don't like playing control decks. You will never see me play something like Pidgeot Control on this channel, because I'm just not good at that archetype. And it's okay if there are decks that you or other people aren't comfortable playing. So yeah, asking for beginner-friendly decks, and you might not like the decks I've recommended as beginner-friendly, and you might be more comfortable with something more complicated. Who knows? But yeah, those are my recommendations on some more beginner-friendly archetypes. Next one comes from Pokedasher 2.2. What's the best way to build a rogue deck? I don't want to scroll through all the cards for hours. Definitely retreading some territory that we just covered here. I understand that. Once again, all the resources that I just listed are great for pre-built rogue decks that have been used in tournament. So we'll go back to Limitless TCG here. Pretty much anything below the top 10 is gonna be in rogue tier territory, and you can pretty much just pick any of these lists. Like, I think at this point, yeah, Blissey EX definitely a rogue tier deck, and you can see it's got some results here and there, and you can click, just copy paste, and you're good. Going back to the tournament results page, looking at the completed tournaments on Limitless, and then just scrolling through, and again, we're going back to the Sinistra Ogerpon deck, and this one did very well. Here's another pre-built deck that someone else has cooked up and proven in a tournament. You could try that out. Pokekabook is also a great resource for rogue tier decks. They pretty much cover anything that has done at least marginally successful in tournament. And yeah, just example here. Here's a bunch of Iron Thorns EX builds. Iron Thorns very much on the fringes of competitive play, but even here, you're going to see some rogue builds that look very cool. If you want to build your own rogue deck, I don't think you have to look at thousands of cards. Like, we're playing in the standard format. There's only the last 2 to 3 years of cards. And then I wouldn't necessarily, for the most part, I don't think you're building decks around just a singular, like a supporter card or a type of energy. I think for the most part, you're looking at Pokemon to build your strategy around. So you can filter out most of the cards and just look at the Pokemon cards. And then from there, if you're thinking about building something that's rogue tier, I think that, for one, if you're looking to build a rogue tier deck, it would be a rogue tier deck for a reason, right? Meta decks are meta decks because they've been proven to be some of the best and most successful archetypes in the game. If people aren't playing it right now and to be considered rogue tier, that there's got to be something that is holding it back from being meta, whether it is it's hard to accelerate energy, maybe it's difficult to play, and maybe the off chance that maybe people just haven't discovered the right combination of cards to make that card work. But there are ways you can assess cards to get an understanding of like, hey, could this be good? And one of the examples I have here, and one of my favorite rogue tier cards, at least at this point in time, is Blastoise EX. And it does have some challenges with it, right? It's a stage 2 Pokemon. It's got it's weak to lightning, which kind of makes it rough against Miraidon and Iron Hands. Although Iron Hands, like depending on the Iron Hands build, you're not necessarily one-shotting Blastoise EX, especially with that solid shell ability. But the thing I found that can be clunky with Blastoise EX is that its attack costs 2 water energy, and then you have to have water energy on hand to discard to swing every single time for meaningful damage. But if you can come up with a way of overcoming that deficiency, you're swinging for 280 damage every turn. If you pair that with a maximum belt, you are hitting for 330, at which point you are one-hit KOing pretty much everything in the game. And when I look at cards and I assess how well it is, I like to look at the limitless matchup data, which I don't actually have it here. So let's go back here, and we're going to go back to the decks and think about like swinging for 280 to 330. Gardevoir is going to be a bad matchup for a Blastoise, right? Raging Bolt, you could one-shot everything in that deck. Lugia Archeops, if you can concentrate your efforts on the 2-prize Pokemon, yeah, maybe that would be good. And even the Chinchino, where I think usually you cap out at 5 energy and you're swinging for 350 damage, Chinchino still can't one-shot a Blastoise EX, which has an effective HP of 360. So maybe Blastoise is okay there. Lost Zone Box, that could be kind of good for you because Lost Zone is a little short on damage and Blastoise is very beefy. Regidrago, you can one-shot everything in that deck. Charizard, you can one-shot Charizard, even though Charizard's like way more consistent, but that's a thing you can do. Dragapult, you can one-shot. Chenpao, you can one-shot. Miraidon, you can one-shot. So like there are merits, and it's not necessarily going to overcome everything that is wrong with Blastoise, but I think you can build a case and say like, hey, there is enough interesting stuff about Blastoise EX that maybe I want to give this a try. And we're going to jump ahead, and here's shout outs to For the Win TCG, who pulled up this Blastoise EX list. I'm pretty sure he got this one from Japan based on my memory of watching this video that won in a tournament. And I like and when I look at something like this, like, and you look at a deck and you look at that card and look to answer some questions about how you build that deck. How are you setting up the deck? And here they've got like 3 Squirtles, 1 Wartortle, kind of prevent against Devolution plays, 3 Blastoise EX. We've got Palkia as a secondary attacker, plus a way of accelerating extra energy on the board, so Blastoise has energy to attack. How do you draw cards? We've got Pidgeot for that, we've got Bidoof for that, or Bibarel for that, we have Radiant Greninja for that. Radiant Greninja can also be a snipe attacker. In terms of setting up, Irida gets us a water Pokemon and an item. And then we've got Maximum Belt to swing for 330 damage, and so on. These are the types of questions that you need to ask of like, how do I make this deck work? And this isn't just rogue decks, this is like everything. Like, how are you drawing cards? How are you setting up your primary strategy? Do you have a primary strategy? How are you hitting the right targets to win the game? Prize mapping. These are all the types of questions you need to ask if you're building a rogue tier deck, or any deck for that matter. One last question from Red 80 Viking, who asks, if you could design 1 EX battle deck, 1 deluxe battle deck, and 1 league battle deck for TPCI, what would they be? This is actually something I would do a separate video for, but we've kind of covered this subject a bunch of times. It's been a couple of months, so my answers have changed a little bit. But yeah, we'll take a stab at that question here, and we're going to work our way from level 3 to 1. And I don't have any insider information. I don't know exactly what's going on. And the lists I'm going to show you, these are just pulled off of Limitless, so they don't necessarily adhere to Pokemon's packaging requirements of like League Battle decks have 6 holo cards and Deluxe Battle decks have 3. I'll talk through the adjustments I would make. I'm just using these deck lists as a reference. But for League Battle decks, Charizard feels obvious, but I don't want to leave it at that, because that feels like, oh yeah, you picked the most obvious archetype. So let's go and dig a little deeper here. One that I think would be very cool in a League Battle deck archetype is Raging Bolt with Ogerpon. And this is one that is it's still a very competitive deck, but it's also a little more beginner friendly relative to other competitive decks out there. And I think this would be a fantastic pick for a League Battle deck. Now, holo foil cards might be an issue. You're not going to get a Radiant Greninja, and that kind of stinks, but you can get Raging Bolt, Ogerpon, and Squawkabilly. Maybe you go 3 Raging Bolt, 2 Ogerpon, and a Squawkabilly to start, or maybe you just leave the Squawkabilly out and you go 3 Raging Bolt, 3 Ogerpon. I think there's a bunch of different ways one can build a Raging Bolt League Battle deck with exactly 6 holo cards, but I think this would be a fantastic archetype to receive in a League Battle deck. For level 2 deluxe battle decks, and just keep in mind, level 2 decks are more your intermediate level, and you only get 3 holo foil cards in the box. I think Goldengo would be fantastic. So we'll disregard the Palkias and the Greninja. Those are rotating out in a couple of months anyway. But 3 copies of Goldengo EX still gets you a pretty solid base from which to build your deck on. You got your own draw engine. You only need 1 energy to attack, and it is an archetype that can one-hit KO anything. And Goldengo has found itself in and out of the meta right now. It's kind of on the fringes of competitive play, but it is a deck that on paper could beat anything. And I think it's a really good archetype to get as a level. It definitely would be better than pretty much anything they've put in a level 2 deck thus far. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that something like a Goldengo or something on this level would eventually show up as a deluxe battle deck. Level 1 decks could be just about anything, but my pick for a level 1 would be Teal Mask Ogerpon EX. It is a really strong card that can be a support Pokemon in a lot of different decks. That Teal Dance ability lets you accelerate energy to itself and then move it to whatever other Pokemon you want with something like Energy Switch. But in the context of a deluxe battle deck where you literally only have 1 EX card, I love Teal Mask Ogerpon because it powers itself up with that Myriad Leaf Shower, and it can start attacking on the second turn without much help. And you're swinging for, maybe you're not swinging for the most damage, but you're doing pretty good damage, especially against other EX battle decks that only have 1 other EX as well. And it's very playable outside of playing against other EX battle decks. So that would be my pick for a level 1 deck. We're going to wrap things up here on the Q&A, but again, thank you to everybody that submitted your questions. And for anyone whose question I wasn't able to answer, I'm sorry I couldn't get to it this time, but maybe we'll get to it on a future post or a future Q&A. If you're interested in asking a question, you can leave a question in the comments of this video, and I'll try and circle back. I'll also put up another community post where you can chime in with your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, I gotta get going. Shrouded Fable stuff is out right now. Gotta get back to the lab and try out some more decks. So until the next one, thank you so much for watching. You can find me on all the things: YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram at @InThirdPerson. You can find me on Twitch at @InThirdPerson, where I stream the Pokemon trading card game every Sunday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And check out the website, inthirdperson.com, for more articles and videos on video games, board games, and other nerdy pursuits. So until the next one, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.